Life is the most dangerous thing you will ever do. Now listen to me while I wax poetically. The mere fact that despite all environmental hazards, diseases, constant need for food, water, shelter, and in general the frailty and strength of the glass cannon known as the human meat suit, even allows for us to survive for an extended amount of time on this planet is nothing short of arguably a miracle. Every day there are multiple opportunities to eat dirt, but we pass right on by it with little to no issues. For instance, every single breath that you take in, you are actually inhaling spores from mold. These spores would absolutely love to colonize your lungs because it's warm, moist, and dark. Really, it is absolutely the perfect breeding ground for this species, but because of the patrolling macrophages of the lungs themselves and how they're constantly clear of these spores, this allows you to not suffocate. Other examples might be just the amount of interactions concerning our body's biochemistry and how everything must work just so in order for us to properly survive for any length of time. If just a few key interactions were off, there would not be really much that would prevent you from flatlining. And yet, billions of us are up and walking around, a lot of us without any issues. It all goes back to our own genetics. The stability of our genes and the system of checks and balances allow for our bodies to operate as they are now and for us to continue thriving for roughly about, or at least hopefully so, 70 to 90 years. But have you ever really stopped to think about how just altering a few things could produce an entirely different existence? What if our immune systems were more aggressive? What if our proteins took a form that made them more stable? What if our genes were literally designed to self-destruct after a certain endpoint is reached concerning generations passed on? Sounds pretty wild, but what's more wild is that's today's topic. In the events of Dead Island 2, a disease known originally as pathogen HK would ransack an island, virtually turning all locals into bloodthirsty infected, while also altering a few select individuals into something more. As this disease was learned about, which if you are interested in how that happened, I actually do have a video breaking down the pathophysiology of specifically this illness, a new variant would be studied and released for very specific reasons concerning our own genetic stability, which we will discuss later concerning the lore today. As this new variant ransacked Los Angeles, a hell on earth if you will, a hell-a, even in its current form, it would become apparent that it possessed a similar ability to change and alter the biochemistry of a person, creating a monster known as the Slobber. Which sounds fun, but in real life, I assure you, it's horrible. So in today's episode, let's discuss the HK1 virus in brief detail, what its purpose is, and how it was able to create the Slobber variant of infected. So like all good stories, we have to start from the beginning, so that we can really, understand the physiological changes that would be inspired by this disease, and ultimately, what would be required to pull this off in the human form, because looking at the Slobber, it is an absolute unit. Initially, in the events of Dead Island, this disease had existed prior, but was for the most part accepted by the tribesmen there that it was just kind of a part of life. In real life, we already have this disease, and it's known as Kuru disease. Kuru disease is essentially a contraction of a prion disease, which can lead to encephalopathy as well as a spongification of the brain itself. But what is that exactly? I'm glad you asked. You're a smart guy. Kuru is absolutely horrible if you weren't aware. You can think of it as very similar to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and how it progresses. But even to this point, what is a prion? Well, a normal prion, Jesus Christ, is PRP, and it's found on the surface of a nerve cell, and its purpose, or at least the hypothesis of its purpose, is that it's somewhat of a scaffold protein, which would make sense. This protein's functional property helps give shape to the neuron and organizes the intracellular signal transduction pathways. What is that? Well, it makes sure that the connections are maintained by giving some sort of rigidity to the actual transduction pathways, which if you extrapolate that idea out, and this is just a general thought that I had, if you could somehow program prions, you may be able to guide a neuron to reach in a certain direction, which naturally they do anyhow, but it appears that maybe some issues arise from this particular function when there's damage involved, which is why when, let's say your spinal cord is severed, which hopefully that doesn't happen to anybody, but if that does happen, it seems that rather than branching out and searching for another neuron after this damage happens, it kind of creates a spike that goes out, which gives a ton of opportunities to miss another dendrite nearby. So potentially by altering the behavior of prions, it may be that the scaffolding could allow for better branching and net-like qualities. Of course, we need to accomplish it without screwing up proteins because, screwed up proteins are basically prions. So a prion disease is a scaffolding protein misfolded. As this protein exists, your body will try to fix it, but therein lies the problem. Specific enzymes will move in to fix the misfolded protein, but fail to do so. It is also hypothesized that in the process, the enzyme itself is damaged, which then it will go around and just misfold other healthy prions into the diseased variant. Along with this, Prions will begin forming chains and blockages in the brain, which in turn will start misfolding other proteins that it comes to contact with. With the scaffolding gone on most neurons, you can kind of see how this would cause issues, or at least the scaffolding has become diseased. Neurological connections begin breaking down. Some neurons are actually strangled by the building prion webs in the brain, and this ultimately results in spongification and swelling of the brain itself. Also, just to jump over to chronic wasting disease, I know this is completely off topic, but something to consider. Now, it's not confirmed, obviously, from officials at the CDC that this is really what happened. They're kind of looking at it more like, well, it could have really been anything, but 2 hunters did contract some sort of prion disease, and they were actually around a deer that had basically had chronic wasting disease, so they're not really sure if it's jumped to humans yet. But one of the things that I found interesting about the topic in general is like, okay, well, when cows had mad cow disease, it was able to jump to humans, so why wouldn't this? If you hunt, just be careful. That's the biggest thing I can tell you. Anyways, so as Kuru disease continues to alter the human neuronal system in a degenerative way, this would cause tremors to begin, random bouts of laughter followed by depression, and many other issues associated with the breakdown of mental faculties. And we will be getting to the actual video game here in a minute, but ultimately this disease results in the end of a person within about 1 to 2 years after onset of symptoms. As it continued to spread on the island though, see, there we go, we're back at Dead Island 1, this would end up creating the infected, as there are some stark differences. Kuru itself results in your end, but clearly those infected with this variant didn't actually completely drop. Instead, their cerebrums were virtually destroyed, and anyone infected would become a shambling infected. This disease was initially traced back to the animals in the area being eaten. This would then spread to the resort and infect everyone there in this outbreak, which would grab the attention of the consortium, as they were known, or the organization. This organization was interested in turning this into something with offensive capabilities, where eventually a new strain would be created. But before we get there, you have to ask yourself, why? Well, to create anything offensive based on biology, I'm gonna go ahead and say it, you're kind of a douche. But there's the obvious answer. Dropping a disease on a country with this type of infection rate and the symptoms it inspired could easily destabilize any nation. But there was another reason, unbeknownst to most others, that has some strange implications. This would specifically be known as an autophage, or the autophage. The autophage would describe something very strange noted by a doctor in the 1990s known as Reuben Reed. He found that human DNA was structured in a very intentional and particular way that ultimately, after a certain generation was reached, it would abruptly shift and change its structure, and this would be known as a zero clock state. As the DNA flipped, this would mean that our eukaryotic multicellular structure that we all basically enjoy right now would shift into a virus-like nanoid whose only function would be to completely disassemble our bodies, and as a result, our domination of this planet. Every person, regardless of if they were infected or not, who reached this state would then flatline out and then be transformed into an aggressive reanimated meat suit, which would then continue to spread this shift to those who may not have naturally turned yet. The generalized theory is that this would take place around 2160. Many populations would then have the shift happen and would begin succumbing to this new genetic shift. There does not appear, though, to be a population who didn't actually have this already instilled in them, and as a result, it is not a matter of if a population is changed, but when. So that would be completely horrific, but it became apparent, however, that this shift could be induced much quicker if there were infected who were contracting this prion Kuru disease. So essentially the idea is that Kuru was literally just accelerating what was already genetically contained within the human genome. As the HK pathogen, which was a combination of this prion disorder and HIV, was released, this would serve as a forced change. But then you have to ask yourself, why exactly could this maybe be seen as a good thing? Well, it depends on what your definition of good is, and maybe if that's your definition of good, I got bad news for you. However, the question could be presented as such. Is it better to commit atrocities to at least save some of humanity, or let it go and have our species go extinct? Actually, I'm gonna ask you. Tell me in the comments, what do you think? But what's strange about this end date also is it appears to be engineered somehow. This would seem to imply that for some reason humanity has an end date which shows direct intervention into our genome from something else. Now, what shape does this take? I'm not saying it was aliens, but something a long time ago had a set point for humanity where if we didn't reach X by then, we would disappear. So let's kind of bring this to a thought experiment, and I know we were getting really out here for a Dead Island 2 video, but what would be its purpose? As we know, Earth is habitable, and as far as we know, there are not many habitable planets out there, at least concerning kind of the vast distances that it would take to get there. It could be that Earth is quite normally found, but it's just really the massive amounts of space that separate us from another habitable planet. If this is in fact the case, it could be that when a species comes across another with promise, then a clock is instilled on them. Now, the ethics of this is completely horrific, and any species that would do this needs to go pound sand, as it's like, all right, well, who died made you god of the species? But the point is this: as this clock is set on the gene, this would basically mean that the species that rises to conquer the planet has a very limited amount of time to reach a certain technological threshold, discover that there is a ticking clock on their own genes, and then they need to figure out how to undo it. In doing so, this would ensure that the species is at least somewhat intelligent and hasn't destroyed their planet yet, and won't continue on indefinitely until their sun just explodes. Sort of like kicking out your 30-year-old offspring out of your basement. You basically want there to be an end date on their stay. If this is the case, then this species may come back after the designated end date and discover whether the kind of younger species that it just totally screwed over survived and is fairly intelligent, which means they may be allowed to continue on or even be enlightened, or that they have failed and they are all shambling infected, which then they will be eradicated, and the process might start back over, allowing for another animal to have a chance at becoming more intelligent. But the same parameters are given to it as well. And this may be the same thing for all habitable worlds, regardless of motives, the human genome having the end date, whereas no other animal appears to, definitely shows that gene editing took place and the clock was ticking for Homo sapiens. So then, why create the HK1 pathogen? Clearly, this would be disturbing to anyone who came across this knowledge. With each successive generation, humanity would be coming closer to its own extinction had it never been discovered. But with this knowledge, it would become about accelerating the clock to determine if anyone was actually immune to the effects. Of course, now you have to ask, how could this happen? Well, the strange thing about DNA is it changes a lot. Random mutations, viruses implanting DNA, meiosis, changing things around. Of course, there are constants, but the reality is sometimes genes can be broken, or their stability can actually kind of spring up from instability. This has rendered some of the human race immune to the effects of the HK1 virus because all the virus does is cause the clock to immediately run out of time, changing you rather than it like happening to your great-great-grand offspring. So give or take like a few generations from that. But by inducing the autophage process 140 years early in specific population control groups, this would yield valuable information. The first is there anyone who is naturally immune? In the events of Dead Island 2, this was confirmed to be the case, likely through the genes having somehow been broken or compensated for their original gene edit. As a result, no changes could be induced by them by being exposed to the HK1 pathogen. Second, if nobody was naturally immune, then the infected could be taken and experimented on in order to find a cure, or at least find some way to prevent humanity from going extinct. But because option 1 was made available, it became apparent those people needed to be studied in order to prevent the eradication of the Homo sapiens race. So with all that said, however, all of those who were infected didn't just turn into your standard infected. Due to the variations in gene structures as well as choices made in life, this would appear to have an impact in just how the autophage de-evolution, which somebody's gonna get mad about that one, like, oh, there's no such thing as de-evolution. I know there's no such thing as de-evolution, but it's just fun to say. But anyways, how the body would regress, I guess is the best way to say it. So for instance, as mentioned in my Crusher video, those who were physically stronger seem to have attributes amplified due to their own propensity to build muscle. This process is backed by the concept of epigenetics, which essentially means basically fetal cell programming in the skeletal muscle, for instance, is in part attributed to the alterations in gene expression due to the actions of a parent in a non-genetic way. Basically, if your parents lift, you are much more likely to have more skeletal muscle as a result due to them altering their own genes. Not to mention, if your parents lift weight, you're much more likely to engage in that behavior as well. I mean, my old man took me to the gym when I was 14 and he's like, good luck with the rest of your life. And I haven't stopped lifting since. But this potentially works in other ways as well, such as with today's main point of focus, which I know we have definitely gone off the reservation talking about this, but the slobber is today what we're actually talking about. So the slobber is a type of infected that isn't doing so hot. While you can be the soldier status guy like the Crusher, this particular variant of infected chose basically the opposite path in life in their human form. Being much larger in size concerning how much stored fat they had on their bodies, it's clear that this is the result of internal issues that have built up over time as well. But how exactly did this happen? Well, like most things, before getting to the internal anatomy, we must first take a look at its overall morphology, as it does help to explain what is even happening inside and where some of its abilities and attributes hail from. As always, you love it. This channel has been cursed with it. Starting with the feet, we see that most slobbers are wearing footwear, thank God. However, as we look at the shoes, we can see the skin inside is completely bloated. We can also assume this bloat is likely lymphatic fluid building in the extremities more so than what is like in the abdomen, which we'll kind of get there in a second. This fluid is typically filtered out by the kidneys, but clearly this is not being done anymore in any capacity. As a result, the fluid is no longer being excreted, and this has swollen the slobber and created several open wounds all over the body. Moving up the leg, we can see this bloat continues, but for the most part, given the pant size and looseness, this person was definitely of a higher body fat percentage in their human life. It may also be possible that the lymphatic system was already struggling to contend with the extra body fat, which in morbidly obese people we know really is like lymphedema or fluid retention. I watch a lot of my 600-pound life. It's a problem. So as we move up past the pelvic region, we begin to see where most concerning problems would actually exist. Their stomach is distended and massive. Sacs exist all over, just barely containing organs within as well as tumors, through almost a translucent skin because it's stretched so thin. In some areas, the wounds go all the way past the abdominal wall and hang like an apron over the pelvic area. As we continue up to the thoracic region, we see wounds and open skin, but it's kind of hard to know if this is a result of the infection or if they were bitten. Moving to the shoulders, tumors and boils continue to grow over this area, and as we move down to the arms, on either side, more boils appear on the forearms specifically, and this could just be a collection of fluid once more, because the lymphatic system is likely not even remotely functional. The arms are a lot like the legs, in which, considering your arms fall by your side, fluid must be transported up to the trunk of the body to be filtered out, and if that's not working, you're gonna get swollen. So as we move to that neck and head, we continue to see more of these sacs around the neck, which will be explained as we move into the internal anatomy in a moment. The face of the slobber is typically destroyed, but not for the reason that you might think. Anything concerning tissue around the mouth is burned away, with boils sometimes appearing on the eyes of the person. The eyes have turned white, indicating heavy damage to the corneas, and the skin itself is typically going to be ashen and gray. As you enter an area with a slobber nearby, what you will find is actually quite stagnant. Now, this could be for a multitude of reasons. There is a degree of mental faculties still running their standard actions of what they were doing in their original life, I guess you could call it. So if this person was sedentary in their human life, they are more likely to be sedentary in their infected life as well. The other reasoning behind this is that due to their weight and how delicate they actually can be, because they're basically being just barely held together, movement is not really their friend. Their whole purpose concerning adaptations appear to be sort of like an area denial and inflicting disorientation. When coming across one, you may find evidence of a highly corrosive substance in piles on the ground. Walking through this, it will immediately begin burning you if it's not been diluted or neutralized. Some of these substances, if they were to get into your eyes, will burn your corneas, making your vision blurry and allowing for other infected to overwhelm you. Internally, how might the slobber be producing this chemical though? Due to the weight of the person that they had on their body, it is highly likely that their intake of food was not really healthy. Possessing a high fat content in anything that they ate, this has several impacts on your body that even if you do it, it does the same thing. Due to how calorie dense high fat food content is, and likely the amount that they clearly ate, this would cause themselves to actually start storing a lot of body fat. Stored body fat is linked to a digestive disorder called GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. Essentially, this is a several-pronged issue. First, the amount a person has eaten can actually overfill their stomach, allowing for the contents to move back into the esophagus, where many issues can happen, such as scar tissue building up, or even stomach cells replacing esophageal cells, which can lead to cancer. Second, the excess fat on their abdomen pressing on their stomach can lead to the contents being forced into the esophagus. And third, the damage to the esophagus over time can cause the sphincter muscle to actually weaken, allowing for the contents to leak back out. Now, this doesn't just happen to obese people, but extra body fat does not help the situation. But GERD itself would not explain why exactly this is happening on such a scale, and for that, we need to move deeper into the body to help explain the process of acid creation. Within your stomach exist cells known as parietal cells, which are responsible for gastric acid secretion. This operates by utilizing a proton pump that will cause acid to actually break down the food that you have. However, this secretion does not work completely alone. For instance, bile, which is typically alkaline, is designed to help break down fat specifically that has been consumed. However, the longer it goes just sitting in your gallbladder, the more acidic it can become. Another thing to also consider is the pancreatic enzymes, which these enzymes are designed to help break down your food, like lipase, for instance, definitely can help break down food, and turn it into usable micronutrients. They break down specifically fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. These three substances can come together in a very detrimental way in your stomach through prolonged food consumption issues, and in turn, this can really screw up your esophagus because it's absolutely corrosive and it's essentially toxic to your esophagus. Along with this, it's important to understand that even though your stomach will secrete a mucus in order to protect itself from specifically acid, a lot of times bile and pancreatic enzymes can still irritate the stomach lining because it is destroying the stomach lining. In their human life, it is highly likely this person would have been suffering from several issues concerning all three of these fluids appearing in high amounts. Along with this, it's likely that GERD may have actually just completely weakened, or it could just be useless at this point, especially if they've already succumbed. Muscles would probably loosen. It's typical for that kind of to happen, but the esophageal sphincter muscle would definitely allow for acid to move up into the lower esophagus, which in turn converted those cells into stomach cells as well, also producing acid, which now sets us up for how this person is turned into what they are. As the infection set in, and their endpoint on their genes was realized, it would appear that what is already there, again, is going to be amplified. Their gallbladder would begin increasing in size along with their stomach and pancreas. But with that being the case, the acid production, bile, and enzymes were all being released into the stomach. It's clear that the stomach cells continue to take over the esophageal cells' locations in the process, likely due to the propensity for these cells to rapidly genetically change and their exposure to a highly acidic environment that they are being met with. As a result, these internal adaptations would allow for them to store and spew massive quantities of combination fluids, which appears to be stored in their abdomen and also up into their neck. Pretty much anything that the digestive system touches, there was fluid that was being stored there. This fluid, in turn, could be rapidly filled by likely the organs that were originally there, or even the tumors may now take on some of these roles that are located all over the abdomen if those are associated with anything relating to GERD. But remember, bile and pancreatic enzymes do still damage the intestinal lining if massive quantities of it are released, as it alters the composition of stomach acid. And because of this, the wounds that we see in the areas of the stomach are likely because it's leaked out of there and it was just eaten through. We see this damage most prominently concerning the face. When the fluid comes out, while the internal systems are protected by mucus production, which naturally occurs in the stomach, the skin and muscle of the face are not. It is also highly likely that saliva production is elevated as well to protect the mouth. And this is actually, if you've ever wondered why you get the mouth sweats before throwing up, your body does this to protect you from the acid. Fun fact of the day. But with the slobber, however, and pretty much just like you, this is not there to really protect the outside of the mouth. And this has ultimately resulted in a massive wound on the face, as well as the jaw. Probably, it would likely fall off at some point. But as it comes across a standard person, the slobber will typically start spewing the stomach contents at them, which again is highly corrosive. Because remember, we eat animals all the time and the acid breaks them down. The same can be said for really anything. Your skin can put up a fight against stomach acid, but through continuous exposure, like being puked on by this thing, it would result eventually in chemical burns if not removed from the skin quickly. Along with this, enzymes and bile would also be affecting the skin as well. But now, realistically, would something like this actually burn through your shoes? It's highly unlikely. The only way I see this happening is if the stomach cells were altered in a way that lowered the pH from the typical 1 to 3 range that you and I have now to something like the battery acid range, which would be 0. But I see this having to be realistically the outcome, as if you've ever gotten just even a little battery acid on your hands before, like even diluted, you can still feel that it burns somewhat as it is dissolving your skin. Should this be applied also with the bile and lipase to break down fats and proteins, then realistically, this could cause much more damage to your body. But in order to do this, the cells would have to concentrate the acid to the point that the mucus may not really be able to save them from the acidic erosion itself. And because of this, as mentioned in another video when talking about the crusher, the very fabric of a cell must be changed. Due to the fact that proteins are the building blocks of cells, it may be that the prion disease that it now has contracted, or basically had unlocked, somehow increases the durability of their cell. Now, would this affect the actual membrane of a cell because it is a phospholipid bilayer? Very unlikely. Because of this, its resistance, like the proteins themselves, must somehow prevent degradation of a cell either through something like a sacrificial layer or through some type of new structure encoded by the indate clock within the genes. The slobber is a disgusting mass of highly concentrated acid and mass. Because of its ability to melt down a person, it should be regarded as very dangerous, but its major drawback for itself is its own slow speed. Its inability to move with agility makes it sort of a non-issue for a normal person, but should it catch you and vomit on you in real life, the acid would likely immediately start breaking down sensitive tissues such as your eyes and lips, and from here it would seep further back, destroying the optic nerve and into the brain itself, degrading it, causing massive internal hemorrhaging, leaving a person completely incapacitated. But even if you were only to get vomit somewhere else on the body, the chemical burns could present issues of infection and blood loss, creating further issues that could still lead to survivability issues. But the reality is, as long as you got away and rinsed yourself off, you would probably be okay. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leave me a like and baller review, and subscribe is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. So I'll definitely be doing video games again. I know it's been a while, and like, I love covering movies and stuff, but God, have I missed covering video games. So we're gonna bring this back, I believe, on Wednesday, or possibly like Wednesdays or Thursdays, and then we will do movies and stuff on Saturdays. So that's basically gonna be the setup for the channel, I think, for the foreseeable future. But I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Tales channel link, where last week we talked about the underwater caving incidents where people just completely go missing in Jacob's Well. It's kind of interesting and more really of a cautionary tale. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astrophysicist, Death's Dancer. Thank you, bro. Next, I'd like to thank our scientists, Chad the Enjoyer of Scientific Explanations of Beauty Horror Movies, Dakota23, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, and Trash Panda in a Trench Coat. Thank you, guys. And to the rest of my patrons, I appreciate y'all's support as well. It goes a long way towards helping me out, and you guys are a bunch of cool guys. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.